My grandmother used to tell me that during the winters of the 1930s, keeping warm wasn't about having the best furnace. It was about outsmarting the cold. When money vanished and fuel was scarce, families trapped heat in newspapers, stored warmth in bricks, and used candles for survival. These weren't clever tricks. They meant getting through winter. Today, we're revisiting 25 real heating methods from the Depression era that kept homes warm without electricity, and a few of them might make you wonder why we ever stopped using them. Newspaper insulation for windows and walls. Walk into any house during the 1930s and you'd find yesterday's news doing double duty as tomorrow's insulation. After families finished reading the paper, those pages became the cheapest weather stripping money could buy. People would take sections of newspaper and layer them directly against single-pane windows, sometimes 5 or 6 sheets thick. The process was simple but deliberate. You'd slightly dampen the paper so it would stick to glass, smooth out any air bubbles, and let it dry in place. For the cracks in walls, particularly around door frames and windowsills, they'd roll newspapers into tight cylinders and jam them into every gap they could find. The reason this work comes down to trapped air. Each layer of paper created a thin pocket of still air, and still air is one of nature's best insulators. It's the same principle that makes double-pane windows effective, except this version costs nothing but yesterday's headlines. The paper also absorbed moisture from condensation, which kept ice from forming on the inside of windows. In houses where the temperature inside might only be 50 degrees on a cold morning, every degree you could hold on to mattered. When spring arrived, people would peel off the layers, save the ones that weren't too damaged, and store them in the attic for next winter. Nothing got thrown away if it could be used again. Door draft stoppers. Cold air sneaking under doors was a constant frustration, and you could feel it the moment you walked past. That draft would cut across the floor and make an entire room uncomfortable no matter how much heat you were pumping in. The solution was a weighted fabric tube pressed tight against the bottom of the door. Making one required basic sewing skills and materials that every household had. You cut a strip of heavy fabric, fold it lengthwise, sew up the long side and one end to create a tube, then fill it with something dense. Rice and sand were common because they packed tightly and added weight. Some people used sawdust or even dried beans. Once it was full, you'd sew up the open end and place it against the door. The weight kept it pressed firmly to the floor, creating a seal that blocked the cold air. The immediate effect was noticeable. That cutting draft disappeared, and the room felt warmer within minutes. These stoppers were especially important on exterior doors and doors leading to unheated spaces like basements or porches. Some households made them decorative, covering them with nicer fabric or embroidering patterns on them. But most were purely functional. The fabric would get dirty from being on the floor, so people would make removable covers that could be washed. This small, simple tool made a measurable difference in comfort and heating costs, and it's still one of the most effective draft-blocking methods available. Rugs and carpets for floor insulation. Heat rises, which means cold settles, and the coldest part of any room was always the floor. Walking on bare hardwood or tile in winter felt like stepping onto ice, and that cold sensation would travel up through your body and make the entire room feel colder than it actually was. Heavy rugs weren't just about comfort. They were about creating a thermal barrier between the frozen ground below and your living space above. Wool rugs were preferred because wool fiber has natural insulating properties, even when woven into fabric. Families would layer rugs, sometimes putting down a cheaper rag rug as padding, and then placing a better wool rug on top. The combination created air pockets that trapped heat and prevented it from conducting down through the floor. In homes built directly on the ground or over uninsulated crawl spaces, this made an enormous difference. The strategic placement mattered too. Rugs went where people spent time, in front of chairs, under dining tables, beside beds. These were the zones where you needed warmth most. Some families would roll up their rugs in summer to keep them clean and save wear, then bring them back out in October and leave them down until April. The routine of preparing the house for winter included covering as much floor space as possible with whatever fabric and padding could be found. It's one of those small changes that accumulates into real warmth. The difference between sitting in a room with bare floors and sitting in the same room with thick rugs might be 4 or 5 degrees of perceived temperature. That's the difference between miserable and manageable. Heavy thermal curtains. Windows were the enemy during cold weather, especially the single-pane windows that were standard in most homes. Even when they were closed, cold air seemed pour through them like they weren't there. The solution wasn't replacing the windows, which nobody could afford. It was covering them with the thickest, heaviest fabric you could find or make. Families would sew together layers of wool, canvas, or heavy cotton into curtains that sometimes weighed 10 or 15 pounds. Some women would add a layer of flannel or even old wool blankets as backing. The key was creating thickness and density. The more material between the cold window and the warm room, the slower heat could escape. These curtains had to hang close to the window frame to seal off the cold air, and they needed to reach all the way to the floor with no gaps. The routine was strict. As soon as dusk arrived, every curtain in the house got drawn. In the morning, the south-facing curtains would open to let in solar warmth, but north-facing curtains often stayed closed all day during the coldest months. In some homes, people would pin or tack the edges of the curtains to the wall to eliminate any drafts from sneaking around the sides. The difference was dramatic. A room with bare windows might drop 10 degrees overnight. The same room with proper thermal curtains would only lose 3 or 4 degrees. That cushion meant waking up to a house that was cold but tolerable, rather than one where ice formed on the inside of the windows. Bubble wrap window insulation. Bubble wrap is modern compared to most of these methods, but the principle it uses goes back much further. During the later years of the Depression and into the 1940s, people experimented with anything that could create dead air space against their windows. When bubble wrap became available, it turned out to be nearly perfect for this purpose. The installation couldn't be easier. Cut the bubble wrap to fit your window, spray a light mist of water on the glass, and press the bubble side against the window. The water creates enough surface tension to hold it in place, and as it dries, the seal gets even better. Each bubble is a tiny pocket of trapped air, and collectively they create an insulating barrier that significantly slows heat transfer. The advantage of bubble wrap over newspaper is that it still allows light through. You can see out the window, though the view is distorted. It doesn't look elegant, but function mattered more than appearance when you were trying to keep your pipes from freezing. A single layer of bubble wrap can reduce heat loss through a window by 40 to 50%. It's not as effective as actual double-pane windows, but it's a fraction of the cost and takes 5 minutes to install. Families would put this up in November and leave it until March, peeling it off when the weather warmed up and saving it for next year. The material holds up well if you're careful with it. Some people reported using the same sheets of bubble wrap for 3 or 4 winters in a row. Hot water bottles. A hot water bottle is simple technology that's been around for over a century, and it remains effective because water has exceptional heat capacity. Water holds onto thermal energy much longer than air or most solid materials. A bottle filled with boiling water and wrapped in a towel would stay warm for 5 or 6 hours, slowly releasing that heat wherever you placed it. The routine was predictable. Before bed, someone would boil water on the stove, carefully pour it into a rubber or metal bottle, seal it tight, wrap it in a towel or cloth cover to prevent burns, and place it at the foot of the bed. By the time you climbed under the covers, the sheets were already warm. That pre-warm bed made the difference between shivering for an hour before falling asleep and being comfortable immediately. Some people would keep the bottle close to their core or against sore muscles for therapeutic warmth. During the day, a hot water bottle could be held on your lap while sitting or placed against your back while working. The portability was the advantage. You could carry warmth with you wherever you went in the house. When the bottle finally cooled down, you'd reheat the water and start over. A single hot water bottle could serve a family through an entire winter if the rubber didn't crack. When rubber bottles wore out, people switched to metal canteens or any sealable container that could handle hot liquid. The concept mattered more than the specific container. Layered clothing and wool blankets. Before central heating became common, staying warm meant dressing for it. The method people used was layering, which worked by trapping air between each layer of fabric. Air is an excellent insulator, And the more layers you wore, the more air pockets you create around your body. The base layer, usually wool or cotton, wicked moisture away from skin. The middle layers, often flannel or more wool, provided bulk and trapped air. The outer layer blocked wind and held everything together. Wool deserves special attention because it has properties that other fabrics lack. Wool fibers have a crimped structure that creates air pockets even within the fabric itself. Wool can also absorb moisture without feeling wet, which prevents that clammy cold feeling you get from damp cotton. A wool sweater and wool socks were essential survival gear during Depression winters. Families would knit these items themselves, reusing yarn from worn-out garments to make new ones. At night, the same principle applied to bedding. Wool blankets were layered on top of regular quilts and sheets, creating a cocoon that trapped body heat. Some people slept in wool caps and socks because your extremities lose heat fastest. The combination of proper layering during the day and heavy blankets at night meant you could maintain body temperature even in a house that dropped to 40 or 45 degrees overnight. It wasn't comfortable by modern standards, but it was survivable, and survival was the goal. Heated bricks in bed. Bricks were everywhere, cheap or free, and they happen to have excellent thermal properties. A brick heated to 300 degrees will stay warm for 4 to 6 hours, making it perfect for overnight warmth. The process was simple but required planning. You'd place clean fire bricks in your oven while cooking dinner or on top of your wood stove for an hour or two. Once thoroughly heated, you'd wrap them in several layers of towels or old fabric to prevent burns and tuck them into bed. The positioning mattered. One brick at the feet kept your toes warm, which prevented that whole body cold feeling that makes sleep difficult. Some people would place a second brick at their back or stomach for additional warmth. The towels served double duty, preventing burns and adding extra insulation that made the heat last longer. By morning, the bricks would still be warm to the touch, though not hot anymore. This method was especially common in homes where bedrooms weren't heated at all. You'd heat the bricks in the main living area where the stove was, then carry them to the cold bedroom when you were ready to sleep. Children would often share bricks, placed between them under the blankets. The weight of a brick also provided a comforting pressure that some people found helped them sleep. And unlike hot water bottles that could leak, bricks were completely reliable. Drop one and it might chip, but it wouldn't ruin your mattress, creating a bed microclimate. The bed became a survival pod during the coldest nights, a carefully constructed microclimate where body heat could be trapped and maintained. This went beyond just piling on blankets. It was a deliberate system of layering different materials to maximize warmth retention. The foundation started with the mattress itself, often placed on a wooden frame to keep it off the cold floor. Under the bottom sheet, people would lay wool blankets or quilts for insulation from below. Then came the regular bedding, followed by multiple layers on top. Cotton quilts, wool blankets, heavy bedspreads, even old coats or towels if more weight was needed. The key was creating layers of trapped air. Some families would tuck the blankets in on 3 sides, leaving just a head exposed, creating an enclosed pocket that held heat like a sleeping bag. Body heat would warm this space within 15 or 20 minutes, and once warm, it stayed warm through the night. The heaviest blankets went on top, because weight helps seal in warmth and prevents drafts from sneaking through gaps. In the coldest conditions, multiple people would share a bed for combined body heat. Children especially would sleep together, sometimes 3 or 4 to a bed, because the combined warmth made a significant difference. Heated bricks or hot water bottles would be added before sleep for extra warmth. The entire bed construction was designed around one goal: trap and hold as much body heat as possible using only materials that were already in the house. Using residual oven heat. After cooking dinner, the oven would still be hot, and letting all that heat go to waste didn't make sense. The simple act of leaving the oven door open after cooking turned the kitchen into the warmest room in the house. That residual heat, which would normally just dissipate inside the closed oven, flowed out into the living space. Families timed their cooking to maximize this benefit. They'd bake bread or roast dinner in the late afternoon, so the oven heat would radiate into the evening when temperatures dropped. After the food came out, the door stayed open until the oven cooled completely. sometimes for 2 or 3 hours. That warmth naturally circulated through the kitchen and into adjacent rooms. This method cost nothing, because you were cooking anyway. It just required a small change in routine. Don't close the oven door after you're done. Some people would pull kitchen chairs close to the open oven and sit there while the heat came out, especially on the coldest nights. Children would sit near it to do homework. The kitchen table became the gathering point, because that's where the warmth was. The only caution was making sure the oven was off and cooling, not heating. Leaving the gas oven on for heat was dangerous and wasteful. This was about using heat that had already been generated for cooking, capturing every bit of thermal energy from the fuel you'd already burned. It exemplified the Depression-era mindset. Nothing gets wasted. Every resource gets used completely. Positioning beds and chairs near heat sources, instead of trying to heat every corner of every room. People brought their living spaces to the heat. Beds got moved to warmer rooms during winter, even if that meant crowded conditions. If you had a wood stove in the kitchen, beds might get set up in the kitchen or the room directly adjacent to it. Sleeping near the heat source meant staying warm through the night without burning extra fuel. The same logic applied to daily living. Chairs and work areas were arranged near stoves or in sunny spots. If you were going to spend hours sewing or reading, you did it where the warmth was. Family gatherings happened in the room with the fire, not the formal living room that couldn't be heated. This adaptive use of space required flexibility and a willingness to live in tighter quarters than might be comfortable otherwise. The positioning wasn't random. People learned from experience where the warm spots were and where cold drafts accumulated. They'd test different arrangements and settle on configurations that maximize comfort. A chair placed 6 feet from the stove might feel cold, but 3 feet away was noticeably warmer. Those few feet made the difference between shivering and being comfortable. This approach also reduced the total area that needed heating. If everyone spent their time in a 200 square foot area near the heat source, instead of spreading through a 1,200 square foot house, the heating requirements dropped dramatically. The house didn't shrink, but the actively used living space did, and that pragmatic adaptation saved fuel and money every day of winter. DIY hand warmers. When the house was cold and you needed to do something that required steady hands, like sewing or writing, keeping your fingers warm became essential. Store-bought hand warmers didn't exist for most people, but the homemade version worked just as well and could be reused indefinitely. The construction was simple. Take an old sock, one that had a hole or had lost its partner, and fill it with dry rice or dried beans. Tie off the open end or sew it shut. When you needed warmth, you'd heat this sock near the stove or in the oven for a few minutes until the rice was warm to the touch. Rice and beans have excellent heat retention properties. They absorb thermal energy and release it slowly over the next hour or two. People would carry these in their pockets while working outside or tuck them into their coat while sitting in a cold room. At night, they'd heat several of them and place them under the blankets near their feet. The warmth would spread through the bed and make it possible to fall asleep even when the bedroom was barely above freezing. Some families made smaller versions for children to take to school. The teacher might keep a pot on the wood stove where students could reheat their hand warmers during lunch. The beauty of this method was its reusability. A single rice-filled sock could last for years and be heated hundreds of times. When rice eventually breaks down and turns to powder, you dump it out and refill with fresh rice. Total cost, essentially nothing. Effectiveness, significant enough that people relied on these throughout the winter months. Makeshift curtains from fabric scraps. New curtains were a luxury nobody could afford, but the need for window covering remained. Women would gather fabric scraps from worn-out clothing, old sheets, feed sacks, anything with usable material, and sew them together into patchwork curtains. These makeshift curtains weren't pretty by conventional standards, but they served their purpose perfectly. The thickness came from layering different fabrics. An outer layer might be heavier cotton or canvas, backed with flannel or wool from old coats. Some women would add a third layer in between for extra insulation. The combination created a substantial barrier against cold windows. The sewing itself became a social activity. Women would gather to work on these projects together, sharing materials and helping each other finish curtains before winter arrived. Every window got covered, even if the curtains didn't match and looked patched together. Function mattered more than appearance. These curtains blocked drafts, held in heat, and in some cases provided a bit of privacy. When they wore out or got damaged, the fabric was salvaged and reused again for something else. Nothing went to waste. The ethic of the time was fix it, make it work. Use it until it absolutely cannot be used anymore. Furniture against exterior walls. Empty wall space, especially on exterior walls, was wasted opportunity. Those walls were conducting cold from outside directly into the living space, and anything you could put between the wall and the room would help slow that heat loss. Heavy furniture became part of the insulation strategy. Families would rearrange their homes specifically for winter. Large wardrobes, bookcases, and dressers got pushed tight against north-facing and west-facing walls where the cold hit hardest. The furniture itself acted as a buffer, creating an air gap between the cold wall and the heated room. The thicker and denser furniture, the better it worked. A solid wood wardrobe full of clothes provided significant insulation value. This wasn't just guesswork. People noticed that rooms with bare exterior walls were harder to heat, and rooms where furniture covered those walls stayed warmer. The difference might only be a few degrees, but those few degrees mattered when you were already struggling to keep the temperature above 60. Some families would even hang thick blankets or rugs on exterior walls if they didn't have enough furniture to cover them. The goal was always the same: add layers between the cold and your living space. In spring, they'd move everything back to more practical arrangements, but come October, the furniture would migrate to the exterior walls again. It was a seasonal routine that required work, but paid off in comfort. Indoor blanket forts and tents. When you couldn't afford to heat the whole house, you stopped trying to heat the whole house. Families would pick one room, usually the kitchen or a bedroom, and create an even smaller space within that room using blankets or tarps draped over furniture. This wasn't a children's game. It was thermal survival strategy that had been used in cold climates for thousands of years. The physics is simple. Body heat can warm a small space much more effectively than a large one. A family of 4 or 5 people, all sitting together under a blanket tent, generates a surprising amount of heat just from metabolism. That heat has nowhere to go, so it accumulates and raises the temperature inside the enclosed space. People would drag chairs together, drape blankets over them to create a canopy, and spend their evenings inside that makeshift shelter. Sometimes they'd bring a hot water bottle or a heated brick inside for additional warmth. These spaces were cramped and not particularly comfortable, but they worked. The temperature inside a blanket fort could be 15 or 20 degrees warmer than the room around it. Families would sit together, talk, play cards, listen to radio if they had one. At bedtime, they'd transition from the fort to a bed that had been pile high with every blanket and quilt in the house. The same principle applied. Keep the space small, trap the heat, and your body does most of the work. This approach saved fuel and made it possible to survive winters without running a furnace constantly. For families in rural areas who relied on wood heat, it meant going through half as much firewood, which translated directly to less labor and more time for other survival tasks. Vegetable oil lamps. When power outages happened or when electric bills couldn't be paid, families needed backup lighting and heat. Vegetable oil lamps provided both. The setup was basic: a heat safe container, vegetable oil, and a wick. Mason jars worked well. Pour cooking oil into the jar about halfway. Insert a cotton wick through a small hole in a metal lid, or just float it with a cork. Light the wick, and you had a lamp that would burn for hours. Vegetable oil doesn't burn as hot as kerosene, which made it safer for indoor use, especially in homes with children. The flame was steady and produced less smoke. More importantly, for heating purposes, multiple oil lamps burning in a small room would raise the temperature noticeably. 3 or 4 lamps could add 5 or 6 degrees of warmth, which was significant in an already cold space. The oil consumption was economical. A pint of oil could burn for 6 to 8 hours, and cooking oil was something most households kept on hand anyway. When oil supplies were low, people would rotate which rooms got lamps, and when ensuring the family spent their evenings together in whatever space was warmest. The lamps also served for cooking in emergencies. You could heat soup or boil water over several lamps if necessary, though it was slow. The versatility made them valuable beyond just their heat output. long-burning survival candles from scraps. When the power went out, which happened frequently in rural areas during the Depression, candles became essential, but buying new candles was expensive, so families learned to make their own from whatever wax they could scavenge. Every candle stub, every bit of wax that dripped onto the table, every old crayon the kids didn't need anymore, it all went into the melting pot. The process became a weekend ritual in many households. You'd collect your wax pieces in a tin can, set that can in a pot of simmering water to melt everything down, and pour the liquid wax into any container that could handle heat. Mason jars were popular, as were old tin cans with the sharp edges hammered down. For wicks, people used cotton string, sometimes twisted with a bit of wax to make it stiffer. The result was a candle that would burn for hours, sometimes 6 or 8 hours from a single jar. These weren't just for light. In a small room, 3 or 4 of these candles burning could actually raise the temperature by several degrees. The heat output from a candle is small, maybe 75 to 80 BTUs per hour, but when you're sitting in a room that's barely above freezing, that warmth concentrates around where you're sitting. Families would gather around the table with these candles in the center, and a combination of the flame's heat and everyone's body heat made the space tolerable. The candles also served as a backup cooking source if the stove couldn't be used. You could heat soup or warm milk over several candles if you had to. When resources are limited, everything has to serve multiple purposes. Candle and brick heater. Combining a candle with thermal mass create a heating setup that's more effective than either element alone. A tea candle by itself doesn't produce much warmth, maybe enough to heat a coffee cup. But if you surround that small flame with bricks that absorb and radiate the heat, you amplify its effectiveness considerably. The arrangement was practical and simple. Set 4 bricks in a square on a fireproof surface. Place a tea candle in the center. Then stack more bricks around and possibly above it in a way that allowed air circulation but captured the heat. The bricks would slowly warm up over the course of an hour. Once they reached temperature, they'd radiate that warmth outward in all directions, creating a pocket of comfort in whatever corner of the room you placed it. This wasn't a primary heat source. You wouldn't heat a whole house with candle and brick setups. But for a small bathroom, a reading nook, or a workspace where you need a bit of extra warmth, it served the purpose. The brick stayed warm for an hour or two after the candle burned out, which extended the useful heat you got from that small amount of wax. Some people would light these setups in the late afternoon and let them run into the evening, timing it so the bricks were at their warmest during the coldest hours after sunset. The cost was minimal, the fire risk was manageable if you were careful, and the comfort gain was real. Clay pot candle heaters. This one looks almost too simple to work, but the science behind it is solid. During the Depression, when people were looking for ways to get more heat out of every candle, someone figured out that clay pots could amplify a small flame into something more useful. You need a few tea light candles, a small terracotta pot, and a larger one to stack on top. The setup was basic. Place 3 or 4 tea lights on a heat-safe surface, maybe a metal tray or ceramic tile. Turn the small clay pot upside down over the candles, but prop it up with a few bricks or bolts so air can still flow underneath. Then place the larger pot over that one, leaving a gap at the top. The candles burn and heat the air inside the first pot. That hot air rises and heats the second pot. Clay is dense and holds heat extremely well, much better than metal, which heats up and cools down quickly. What you end up with is a radiating heat source that stays warm long after the candles have burned down. The clay absorbs the thermal energy and releases it slowly, spreading the warmth more evenly across a small space. This wasn't going to heat a whole room, but if you were sitting at a desk or working at a table, having one of these nearby made a noticeable difference. The heat was gentle and constant, not the flickering direct heat of an open flame. Some people would make several of these and place them strategically around the house. The candles themselves would last 3 or 4 hours, and the pots would stay warm for another hour after that. For the cost of few tea lights, which could be made from candle scraps, you could create a pocket of warmth that made cold evenings more bearable. If you're finding these old methods useful, hit that subscribe button. We've got more Depression-era wisdom coming your way that could save you real money this winter. Soapstone heat storage. Soapstone is one of nature's best materials for holding heat, which is why it's been used for this purpose for centuries. It's a dense metamorphic rock that absorbs thermal energy slowly and releases it even more slowly. A soapstone slab the size of a thick book can store enough heat to stay warm for 6 or 8 hours after being heated. During the Depression, families who had access to soapstone would acquire slabs of it and turn them into portable heating devices. The process was simple. Place the stone near your stove, on top of it if possible, or inside your oven while you're baking. Let it heat for at least an hour, longer if possible. Once it's thoroughly hot, which you can test by carefully touching the edge, wrap it in a towel to prevent burns and place it wherever you need warmth. People would put heated soapstone slabs under their desk while working, at the foot of the bed before sleeping, or on their lap while sitting and reading. The stone would radiate consistent warmth for hours, much longer than a hot water bottle or heated brick. The heat wasn't intense. It was gentle and steady, which made it comfortable to keep close to your body. Soapstone doesn't crack from repeated heating and cooling cycles the way some rocks do, so the same pieces could be used winter after winter. Some families had soapstone slabs that had been in use for decades, passed down through generations as reliable heating tools. For folks watching who remember these methods, drop a comment about what your family did to stay warm. We'd love to hear those stories. Masonry heaters with internal channels. Traditional fireplaces have always had one major flaw. Most of the heat shoots straight up the chimney while you're sitting there freezing. Our ancestors figured this out pretty quickly, and in European immigrant communities especially, they brought over knowledge of masonry heaters that have been used for centuries. These weren't your standard brick fireplaces. They were engineered heat batteries built right into the structure of the home. The design centered on creating a maze for the hot smoke to travel through before it could escape. Instead of a straight chimney, they built a series of internal channels that zigzagged through several tons of brick or stone. You'd build a hot, fast-burning fire using small pieces of wood. And as the smoke traveled through these channels, the masonry absorbed an enormous amount of thermal energy. The fire itself might only burn for 2 or 3 hours, but the brick would stay warm for the next 12 to 16 hours, radiating gentle, even heat the entire time. What made this revolutionary was the efficiency. A regular fireplace might capture 10 or 15% of the fire's heat. A well-built masonry heater could capture 70 or 80%. Families would build their fire in the morning, go about their day, and the house would stay comfortable well into the evening without burning another stick of wood. The initial construction required skill and labor, but once it was done, it was done. Some of these heaters from the 1930s are still standing and still working in old farmhouses across the Midwest. Passive solar heat storage. The sun was putting out free heat every single day, and families who understood this had a real advantage. The trick was catching that heat and holding on to it after the sun went down. This wasn't complicated technology. It was simple observation and smart design choices that anyone could implement if they understood the principles. South-facing windows were critical. In the northern hemisphere, winter sun comes from the southern sky at a lower angle, and a south-facing window will capture far more sunlight throughout the day than any other orientation. Families would clean those windows obsessively, because even a thin layer of dirt could reduce the amount of sunlight getting through by 20 or 30%. Once the sunlight was coming in, you needed something to absorb and store it. Stone floors, brick walls, even concrete. These dense materials have what's called thermal mass. They heat up slowly, but once they're warm, they release that heat slowly too. The daily routine was straightforward. In the morning, you'd open the curtains on the south side and let the sun flood in. If you had interior doors, you'd keep them open so the warm air could circulate naturally. The stone floor would soak up the heat all day long. Then, as the sun started to set, you'd close heavy curtains to trap that warmth inside. The floor would keep radiating heat well into the night. On a sunny winter day, this passive system could keep a small house comfortable from mid-morning until bedtime without burning any fuel at all. The homes that were built with this in mind, with the right window placement and the right materials, stayed naturally warmer. The homes that weren't, well, those families had to work a lot harder to stay comfortable. Chimney balloons and dampers. An open chimney is essentially a hole in your roof that's designed to let air escape, which is fine when you have a fire burning, but terrible when you don't. Even with the flue technically closed, older chimneys leaked significant amount of warm air and allowed cold drafts to flow down into the house. The solution was to plug that hole more effectively. A chimney damper is a metal plate inside the chimney that you're supposed to close when the fireplace isn't in use, but many of them didn't seal well, especially in older homes. A chimney balloon, which became more common later but was improvised earlier, is an inflatable bag you push up into the chimney flue and inflate to create a tight seal. During the Depression, people got creative with whatever materials they had, sometimes using wadded-up newspaper or fabric bags stuffed with insulation. The effect was dramatic. Closing off an open chimney could reduce heat loss by 70 or 80% compared to leaving it open or relying on a leaky damper. You could feel the difference immediately. The room stopped having that persistent draft, and the furnace didn't have to work as hard to maintain temperature. The key was remembering to remove the blockage before lighting your next fire. Otherwise, you'd smoke yourself out of the house. Some families would hang a reminder tag or marker near the fireplace as a visual cue. This simple act of properly sealing the chimney saved fuel and money throughout the winter and required almost no effort once you got into the habit. Haybox insulation for heat retention. Before electric slow cookers existed, the Haybox was the original set-it-and-forget-it cooking method. It also demonstrated a principle that applied to heating. Natural materials like hay, straw, and can trap heat with incredible efficiency. The concept was straightforward. Line a wooden box or crate with several inches of loose hay or straw, creating a nest. Place your heat source, whether it's a hot pot of stew or a heated stone, in the center of that nest, then cover with more hay and close the lid. The trapped air between all those plant fibers acts as insulation, slowing the rate at which heat escapes. A pot of boiling water placed in a hay box could stay hot enough to finish cooking beans or stew over the course of 4 or 5 hours without any additional fuel. People applied the same principle to keeping things warm in general. A hay box placed in a cold room with heated bricks or stones inside would radiate warm for hours. This method required space and materials that not everyone had access to, especially in cities. But in rural areas where hay was abundant, it was common practice. The insulation value was comparable to modern materials like fiberglass, all from something that grew in the field and could be replaced for free every year. Some families kept their hay boxes going all winter, refreshing the heated stones inside twice a day to maintain a constant source of gentle warmth. It wasn't enough to heat a room by itself, but combined with other methods, it contributed to overall comfort and reduced the amount of fuel needed from the stove. Trombe walls. This is one of the more sophisticated passive solar techniques, though it's based on straightforward physics. A Trombe wall is a thick wall, usually made of concrete, brick, or stone, painted black or dark brown, and placed behind a pane of glass. The glass creates a greenhouse effect, trapping solar heat against the dark wall surface. That wall absorbs the heat throughout the day and stores it in its thermal mass. During the Depression, full-scale Trombe walls were rare because they required resources and planning during construction, but some families improvised versions by painting a south-facing stone wall black and mounting salvage windows in front of it. The principle worked the same way. Sunlight hits the dark wall, converts to heat. The wall absorbs and stores it, and then slowly radiates that warmth into the house over the course of the evening and night. A well-designed Trombe wall could collect enough solar energy on a sunny winter day to keep a room comfortable well past midnight. The thickness of the wall matters. The more thermal mass you have, the more heat you can store. Walls that were 12 to 18 inches thick were ideal. Some designs included vents at the top and bottom of the wall, so warm air could circulate into the room by convection during the day, while the wall itself continued radiating heat at night. This wasn't something you could add to just any house. It required the right orientation, the right materials, and some construction knowledge. But for families building or renovating during that era, incorporating passive solar elements like this meant permanent reductions in heating costs. These walls are still being built today in energy-efficient homes for exactly the same reasons they were used 90 years ago. DIY solar heat absorbers. The sun was free energy, and people who understood that had an advantage during hard times. A solar heat absorber is essentially a homemade device that captures sunlight, converts it to heat, and moves that warm air into your house. The construction required some handiwork, but the materials were often salvaged from other projects. The basic design used a wooden frame with a sheet of glass or clear plastic on the front, and a flat piece of metal painted black on the back. Black surfaces absorb the most solar energy, and metal conducts that heat efficiently. You'd mount this frame on a south-facing wall or prop it up outside a south-facing window at an angle to catch maximum sunlight. As the sun hit the black metal, the temperature inside the box would rise dramatically, sometimes reaching 140 or 150 degrees on a sunny day. The hot air naturally wants to rise, so if you cut a vent at the top of the box that opened into your house and another vent at the bottom to draw in cool air, you'd create a convection loop. Cold air from a room flows into the bottom of the box, heats up as it passes over the hot metal, and flows back into the room through the top vent. No electricity, no moving parts, just physics doing what physics does. On clear winter days, a well-built solar absorber could pump warm air into a room for 5 or 6 hours straight. It wouldn't heat your whole house, but it took the edge off and reduced how much fuel you needed to burn. Some people built multiple units and mounted them on different walls. The more surface area you had collecting sunlight, the more heat you could generate. When night fell or clouds rolled in, you'd close the vents to prevent the system from running in reverse and pulling warm air out of the house. These contraptions required maintenance, keeping the glass clean and repainting the black metal every few years. But the fuel savings made it worthwhile. Radiant barrel heater. A standard wood stove puts out heat primarily from its small surface area, which limits how much warmth it can radiate into the room. Families found that mounting a metal barrel horizontally above the stove dramatically increased the heating efficiency. The barrel, typically a 55-gallon drum, provided a much larger surface area that absorbed heat from the stove and radiated outward. The setup required securing the barrel safely, usually with metal brackets or chains, positioned close enough to the stove to capture heat, but not so close that it created a fire hazard. Some people would add fire bricks inside the barrel to increase thermal mass, which made it hold heat longer after the fire died down. The result was a heating system that warmed the room much more evenly and efficiently. A barrel heater could make a single wood stove heat twice the space it normally could, or the same space using half the wood. For families that had to cut and haul every log themselves, reducing wood consumption by 40 or 50% was significant. It meant less labor, less time spent outdoors in the cold, and longer stretches between refueling. The barrel would stay warm for hours after the fire went out, providing residual heat that carried through the coldest part of the night. The downside was that barrel heaters could get extremely hot. You had to be careful not to touch them, and anything flammable needed to be kept well clear. But for families who understood the fire safety principles and built the system properly, it was one of the most effective ways to maximize heat from a limited fuel supply. Straw bale insulation. Straw bales represent one of the most effective natural insulation materials available, with an R value that competes with modern synthetic insulation. During the Depression, especially in agricultural areas, straw was abundant and essentially free. Families building new homes or improving existing ones would stack tightly compressed straw bales as walls or pack them against existing walls for insulation. The secret is the structure of straw itself. When compressed into bales, the hollow stems create millions of tiny air pockets. Those pockets trap still air, and still air is what prevents heat transfer. A straw bale wall 18 inches thick could have an R value of 40 or higher, meaning it was extraordinarily resistant to heat flow. Heat stayed in during winter and out during summer. The construction required covering the straw with plaster, stucco, or clay protected from moisture and pests. Once properly sealed, these walls would last for decades. Houses built with straw bale construction during the 1930s are still standing and still providing excellent insulation. The technique wasn't limited to new construction. People would stack bales against the north side of existing houses, creating an exterior insulation layer that dramatically reduced heat loss through those walls. Straw bale insulation worked so well that rooms stayed comfortable with minimal heating. Families reported burning half as much wood or coal compared to before the insulation was added. The labor was intensive, the bales were heavy, and the plastering required skill. But once complete, the work paid dividends every winter for generations. Isolating cold rooms. Heating an entire house when you could barely afford a heat part of it didn't make sense. Families learned to concentrate their living in the warmest areas and essentially abandon the coldest rooms until spring. This strategy meant picking which spaces mattered most and shutting off everything else. Unused bedrooms, storage areas, formal dining rooms that weren't needed, these spaces got closed off. Doors stayed shut. Vents were sealed with cardboard or fabric. And sometimes blankets were hung over the doorways to add an extra barrier. This created a buffer zone of cold air that actually helped insulate the living areas. The cold rooms absorbed some of the exterior cold before it could reach the occupied spaces. The living area shrank to maybe 3 or 4 rooms. Kitchen, main bedroom, living room, bathroom. All the heat generated from cooking, body warmth, and any stove or fireplace stayed concentrated in that smaller space. The same amount of fuel that would barely heat 8 rooms could keep 4 rooms comfortable. Families adjusted their routines around this reality. Everyone gathered in the kitchen during the day because that's where the stove was. Everyone slept in 1 or 2 bedrooms instead of spreading out. This approach required discipline. It meant not wandering through the cold parts of the house unnecessarily. It meant keeping doors closed even when it felt restrictive. But the energy savings were enormous, sometimes reducing fuel consumption by 60 or 70% compared to trying to heat everything. When spring arrived and temperatures rose, the whole house would open up again. But during the hard months, smaller was smarter. Composting pile heat. This is one of the more unusual methods, but it's based on solid science. When organic matter decomposes, the bacterial action generates significant heat. A properly built compost pile can reach internal temperatures of 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit and maintain that heat for months. Resourceful families found ways to capture that free thermal energy. The pile needed to be large enough to generate and sustain heat, typically at least 3 feet in all dimensions. Materials went in layers: brown matter like dry leaves and straw for carbon, green matter like food scraps and fresh plant material for nitrogen, a bit of soil or manure to introduce bacteria. The bacteria would start breaking everything down, and the center of the pile would get hot. You could feel the heat radiating off it if you stood nearby. Some families built compost piles against the foundation of their homes or near exterior walls, letting the heat conduct through into the house. More sophisticated setups ran water pipes through the center of the pile. Cold water went in one end, hot water came out the other, providing warm water for washing or for radiant floor heating. The pile needed turning every few weeks to maintain the bacterial activity, and you'd add fresh materials as the old stuff broke down. This wasn't a primary heating method for most families, but as a supplemental heat source, it worked surprisingly well. It also served its intended purpose of creating compost for the garden. The same pile that kept you warm in January would fertilize your vegetables in May. That kind of dual-purpose thinking was common during the Depression. Everything had to serve multiple roles. Reflective foil behind radiators. Radiators and furnaces during the Depression were often located against exterior walls, which created an obvious problem. Half the heat they produced was radiating directly into the wall and ultimately outside. It was like trying to warm your house while leaving the windows open. Aluminum foil, which was becoming more common in households by the 1930s, provided a dead simple solution that cost almost nothing. The application was straightforward. Cut a piece of aluminum foil or any reflective material larger than the back of your radiator. Use paste, tape, or even just wedge it behind the radiator so the shiny side faces the room. That reflective surface bounces the infrared heat back into the living space instead of letting it soak into the wall. The effect was immediate and measurable. Rooms heated up faster, stayed warmer longer, and families could run their furnaces less. This principle works because radiant heat, which is what radiators produce, travels in straight lines like light. A reflective surface redirects those heat waves, just like a mirror redirects visible light. Some families got creative and used polished metal sheets or even carefully flattened tin cans to achieve the same effect. In homes where fuel oil or coal was rationed or expensive, every bit of efficiency mattered. This simple modification could reduce heating costs by 10 or 15% over the course of a winter, which was significant money when most families were living on a few dollars a week. The same principle applies today. If you have radiators against exterior walls, This trick still works exactly as it did 90 years ago. These 25 methods aren't historical curiosities. They're proof that warmth doesn't require expensive technology or high energy bills. It requires understanding how heat works and using that knowledge creatively. Our grandparents survived winters that would send most of us running for the thermostat, and they did it with newspaper, bricks, and common sense. Which of these methods would work in your home right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to see more ways our grandparents built and lived smarter, check out our video on 25 home features that disappeared. Remember when milk chutes were standard? Or when every house had a coal cellar? Those stories are waiting for you. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching.